Owen slid the compliance export across the conference table and kept his hand on it for a second, as if he needed the paper to stop shaking before his voice could start. 11 people were in that room, and every one of them had watched me sit through 6 weeks of being treated like I was confused about my own work. Dana sat 2 seats to my left, upright, composed, a pen balanced across her notebook like she was prepared to correct me one more time. Priya looked at the same export and said, very quietly, that the warning entry had been created after my self-review was submitted. Mia asked Owen to read the timestamps aloud for the room. He read date, time, editor identity, record type, and revision sequence in one unbroken line. And what had been a debate about memory became a chronology no one could argue with. April 3rd, 2026, my self-review submitted. April 5th, 2026. Manager comment draft saved. April 7th, 2026. Verbal warning field created in HRIS by Dana Mercer. April 8th, 2026. Annual review delivered with a 2 out of 5 and a citation to a warning I had never received. Priya looked up and asked Dana whether employee acknowledgement had ever been collected. Dana did not answer immediately, and silence moved across that table faster than any raised voice ever could. I remember Mia folding her hands and choosing her words with the caution people use when they know they are making a record. She said we were no longer discussing performance coaching style, we were discussing retroactive discipline insertion. Louise stared at the table. 2 team leads exchanged a look they would later pretend never happened. My pulse had been loud in my ears for 40 minutes, but in that moment, it went quiet. Priya said policy required warning documentation within 2 business days and a documented acknowledgement step, and she said both elements were missing. The vote to amend happened in the same room where Dana had spent months undermining me in front of peers. Mia called it point by point, void the warning entry, restore rating band, reissue review record, reopen promotion slate for May cycle. Every person present heard my rating move from 2 out of 5 back to 4 out of 5, which meant my merit increase went back to 4%, and the people who had watched me be minimized now had to watch the correction enter the file while I sat there saying almost nothing. I did not thank anyone for believing me because this never belonged to belief. It belonged to records. 10 days earlier, I had not known that meeting would happen, and I had not known whether I would still have a clean track in this company by summer. I only knew one thing on April 8th, 2026, when I opened my annual review and saw language that made my hands go cold. The line read, needs improvement, 2 of 5. The paragraph beneath it cited a prior verbal warning related to collaboration and communication. No date of conversation, no acknowledgement note, no attachment, no witness reference, just a sentence presented as settled fact. I read that page 3 times before I noticed I had stopped breathing normally. I had been at Northbridge Health Systems for 3 years at that point, long enough to know the review system and long enough to understand exactly what a 2 out of 5 would do. A 2 dropped me out of my compensation band, blocked the 4% merit tier, and took my name off promotion consideration before anyone said it out loud. People think panic looks dramatic. Mine looked like me closing the laptop, opening it again and checking whether I had missed a sentence that explained the warning. There was no explanation. In 2024, my rating had been exceeds, and the primary evidence in that review was a reporting automation rollout I led for our quality operations division. Before that project, we had analysts stitching together hand-checked data from 3 systems every Friday. I built a workflow that pulled source tables directly, flagged drift in measure definitions, and cut manual reconciliation time hard enough that our weekend backlog finally stopped swallowing Monday mornings. Dana had signed off on that project's outcomes herself. The same person who praised my documentation discipline in 2024 now wrote that I had needed a formal verbal warning. The wound for me was older than Northbridge. I had spent most of my career being the woman in the room people trusted once numbers were broken and deadlines were on fire, and underestimated right up until the moment I fixed the thing they said I didn't understand. I learned early that over-explaining never helped. Calm did. Documentation did. Clean timelines did. When someone tried to move the conversation onto personality, I kept it on process and evidence. That habit looked detached from the outside, and Dana used that misreading against me once she decided I was easier to sideline than to engage. My calm read as surrender to her, so she overcommitted to a fixed timeline and said in repeated forums that a warning had already happened before my April review, a claim she later could not walk back. Northbridge was a prestige system in our region, the kind of place where your internal reputation followed you into budgets, project assignments, and director-level succession planning. Quality operations sat in a high visibility lane because our work touched external reporting, payer contracts, and board dashboards. A rating dispute in that environment was not private embarrassment, it was a reputational event. When a manager wrote you down in a calibration cycle, team leads heard about it, directors heard about it, and the same people who watched your standing drop would be present if your standing ever came back. I joined in 2023 because I wanted that level of rigor. I wanted a place where standards were explicit and traceable, where you could prove quality instead of performing confidence. The first year was heavy lifting and quiet wins. I learned every reporting pathway, mapped handoff points between operations and analytics, and built a reputation for catching field-level inconsistencies before they became board-level errors. Mia noticed that work before Dana did. Mia was division director, detail-oriented, fair once facts were clear, not sentimental. Dana was operations manager, good in upward meetings, less careful when she thought no one would challenge her framing. In 2024, when I earned exceeds, Dana congratulated me in front of the team and said I had rare follow-through. I remember that phrase because it sounded like acknowledgement and warning in the same breath. The rollout that year made me visible across departments, and visibility in a hierarchy creates trade-offs. You get invited into rooms where decisions are made, and you become threatening to anyone whose authority depends on controlling what gets seen. At the time, I read Dana's warmth as cautious support. Looking back, I can see she was measuring where my credibility might constrain hers later. The shift started in March 2026, and it started with data integrity errors. We had monthly quality measures moving into an executive summary, and I caught a mismatch between denominator definitions used by operations and definitions required in our external reporting standard. It was not a subtle issue. If left alone, it would have inflated one measure and depressed another, which meant leadership decisions built on a false signal. I flagged it in writing, with source references and a corrected logic map. Dana replied that my concerns were technical overreach and removed me from 2 leadership huddles the same week. Exclusion became her method. When huddle invites went out, my name vanished from recurring lists I had been on for months. If I asked for meeting notes, she sent summaries that omitted decision rationale and timeline owners. If I raised discrepancies in shared forums, she reframed them as interpersonal friction and asked whether I was aligned on communication norms. The language mattered. She shifted discussion from data accuracy to my tone, because tone arguments are easier to win in a room where hierarchy is already tilted. Luis saw this happen repeatedly, and he kept his eyes on his notebook because conflict avoidance had become survival behavior for him. The first public humiliation landed during a cross-functional forum where analysts, team leads, and 2 directors were present. I asked for clarification on a measure definition that had changed without version control. Dana smiled and said, "Brooke, we covered this in Leadership Huddle, maybe catch up offline before questioning standard work." 12 faces turned toward me. The point was not correction. The point was placement. She put me outside leadership in front of people who tracked status through Access. I said I would review the update and document any remaining variants. I wrote those exact words down after the meeting because I knew I would need the precision later. Her escalations followed a pattern. She reassigned one of my ongoing analyses to a junior analyst without notifying me, then commented in a team check-in that I seemed disengaged from shared priorities. She asked me to take notes in a forum I used to present in, then told the room she appreciated people who support the team in whatever role is needed. She interrupted me twice during an operational review and asked whether I had received coaching on collaborative delivery. That phrase, coaching, was her bridge to discipline language, and she kept using it in front of witnesses. I could feel myself wanting to defend in real time, wanting to list every project, every documented contribution, every instance where she changed scope after approval and blamed execution. I had done that in earlier jobs and watched it fail. Defensiveness fed the story that I was emotional and difficult. Documentation cut through that story. I kept a private log with dates, participants, exact wording when possible, and attachments where available. I exported calendar records weekly. I saved policy links in a folder labelled Reference so I would not waste time hunting for them under pressure. The review cycle opened in late March and self-assessments were due April 3rd, 2026. I submitted mine before lunch that day, concise, evidence-linked, no inflated language. My document listed completed deliverables, quality outcomes, and cross-team support with date-stamped references. I did not mention Dana's behaviour because self-reviews are not the place for grievance narratives, and I still believed process could hold if I stayed disciplined. The system confirmed submission at 11:42 a.m. I took a screenshot out of habit and filed it. That screenshot became one of the quiet anchors under everything that followed. On April 8, 2026, Dana delivered the annual review in a short meeting scheduled for 20 minutes. She moved quickly, said my collaboration had declined, said there had been prior coaching and a verbal warning, and said the 2 out of 5 reflected pattern, not incident. I asked for the warning date and acknowledgement record. She said it was addressed verbally in context, which answered nothing. I asked whether the entry was in HRIS. She said yes. I asked for a copy of the policy language tied to warning documentation. She said HR could provide that. The meeting ended with her standing before I did. The moment I reached my desk, I checked the dispute policy. Our system allowed 10 business days to file a formal review challenge from date of delivery. I filed on April 9th, well inside the window because hesitation would have shifted leverage toward procedural closure. The rebuttal I uploaded was 947 words, and every paragraph tied a claim to a record. I disputed the warning as undocumented and unacknowledged, disputed the rating rationale as unsupported by objective metrics, and requested HRIS, record history including creation timestamps and editor identity for all disciplinary fields tied to my review cycle. Writing those 947 words took less time than deciding what not to include. Anger wanted adjectives. Evidence required restraint. I removed 3 lines that described how humiliating those public comments had been because humiliation was visible to witnesses and I did not need to narrate feelings to make policy relevant. I cited the warning documentation standard directly, including the 2 business day requirement for entering verbal warning notes and the acknowledgement step expected from the employee record. If Dana had truly delivered that warning, there should have been a trace inside that timeline. Priya Nair called me on April 14th. Her voice was procedural, neutral, the voice of someone balancing fairness with institutional caution. She said an entry did exist in HRIS under warning-related fields associated with my cycle. She also said the timestamp required further review because it appeared later than expected relative to my self-review submission. She did not speculate. She said she wanted compliance support before making conclusions. I asked for metadata review in writing within the same hour. She acknowledged and copied internal compliance. That copy line included Owen Fletcher, whose name I knew only from audit trainings. Owen had the kind of job people only remembered when they needed proof. Internal compliance in our system maintained access logs, audit trail interpretation, and control documentation for sensitive records. He had been quiet in every training I attended, careful, precise, and visibly aware that accuracy could create enemies. For the first stretch of this dispute, he stayed quiet too, replying only with scheduling language and no substantive comment while Dana kept presenting her timeline as uncontested in team forums. When he replied to Priya's thread with a single sentence saying he would validate chronology against immutable system logs and provide an extract suitable for calibration review, his silence finally took shape as setup instead of absence. I read that sentence 5 times and understood 2 things immediately. He had taken the request seriously, and his findings would be hard to bury if he brought them into the room. Dana reacted before findings were released. In a team sync, she said, in front of Luis and 2 senior analysts, that formal complaints do not change accountability, and she looked directly at me when she said it. She framed my dispute as avoidance. She said coaching conversations had happened repeatedly and implied I was rewriting history because compensation was involved. I answered with 1 sentence. My filing requests record verification under policy. She smirked in that way people do when they expect the crowd to side with confidence over precision. I could feel Luis freeze beside me. After that sync, Luis sent me a short message asking if I needed anything documented. I did not respond immediately because I knew what writing a witness statement could cost him. He had watched Dana punish people through assignment dilution, exclusion from visibility meetings, and comments that branded them difficult. 2 days later, he asked again, this time with a direct line saying no verbal warning had occurred in the meetings where Dana later claimed it happened. I replied with a policy excerpt and told him to write only what he had personally witnessed, nothing interpretive. He sent a signed statement that evening. The statement resolved a specific obstacle that had been weighing on me. Before Luis wrote, Dana could frame the issue as one person's memory against another's authority. After Luis wrote, her timeline acquired a witness problem in addition to a logging problem. Priya acknowledged receipt and added it to the dispute file. She also scheduled calibration for April 18, 2026, with directors, team leads, HR, compliance, and relevant management. The attendee list was 11 people. I counted twice because I knew exactly how public this would be and how many people would carry the result into the rest of my career inside that building. The night before calibration, I slept in short fragments and woke up before my alarm. I reviewed my folder one final time: policy language, self-review timestamp, disputed review copy, rebuttal text, witness statement, and the questions I would answer if asked. I did not prepare a speech because speeches invite argument over tone and intent. I prepared chronology. I also prepared for the possibility that process would fail me and the record would stay dirty. That possibility sat with me while I drove in, while I badged through security, while I waited outside a room where people who barely knew my work would decide what counted as truth. Calibration opened with Dana presenting first. She said my performance decline had been evident since early March. She said she had delivered a verbal warning in real time during a coaching discussion, and she said my rebuttal represented disagreement with feedback rather than procedural defect. She sounded practiced. She used institutional language fluently. If the room had ended there, she might have kept control of the narrative. Mia asked me for response. I said I disputed chronology, not feedback preference, and requested review of policy-required warning timing and acknowledgement records against system metadata. Priya nodded and opened her file. Priya confirmed policy first. Warning documentation required entry within 2 business days of the conversation and employee acknowledgement in the record. She said the current file lacked acknowledgement. She said the entry timing raised discrepancy concerns relative to the self-review sequence. Dana said coaching happened informally, and entry timing could vary due to workload. Priya replied that informal coaching and formal warning were distinct categories in policy and could not be conflated once discipline language was attached to rating rationale. The room shifted. People who had been leaning back sat forward. Mia asked compliance to present chronology to remove subjectivity from the discussion. That request resolved another obstacle in plain view. Until Mia requested compliance, Dana could keep the exchange in managerial interpretation territory where confidence often wins. Once compliance entered, the question became technical. Owen opened his laptop, connected to the room display, and projected the audit extract. His voice was steady, measured, almost understated, as he walked through system events. He explained which fields were user editable, which logs were immutable, and how revision IDs mapped to user accounts. He identified the warning field creation on April 7, 2026, after my self-review on April 3rd, and 1 day before review delivery on April 8th. Dana interrupted to say she had discussed warning content earlier and only entered it later due time pressure. Owen did not engage the framing. He continued with chronology and pointed to absence of acknowledgement workflow completion. He stated that the record did not show an earlier warning entry subsequently edited. It showed initial creation on April 7th, tied to Dana's credentials. Priya confirmed this interpretation matched HRIS behavior for our configuration. Mia asked whether any documented evidence existed of a warning conversation before April 7th. None was produced. I could hear one of the team leads exhale hard like he had been holding tension for weeks. Mia turned to Luis and asked whether he wanted to add context from his written statement. His hands shook when he picked up his notes. He said, clearly, that no warning conversation occurred in the meetings Dana had cited. He added that he had not observed any warning conversation in follow-up moments around those meetings either, no explicit warning language, and no request for acknowledgement. Dana looked at him like he had crossed a line, which he had. He had crossed from silent enabler to witness, and that line changed what the room could ethically ignore. The core conflict ended right there, even though formal words came later. A disputed memory can be debated for hours. A time-stamped record, missing workflow step, and corroborating witness collapses that space fast. Priya stated that based on record chronology and policy requirements, the warning entry could not stand as valid disciplinary documentation. Mia said the review rating relied materially on that warning claim and could not remain unchanged. She asked for immediate amendment recommendation. Priya recommended voiding the warning, restoring prior rating band to 4 out of 5 pending updated narrative text, and issuing corrected documentation same day. Mia called for agreement from the calibration attendees, one by one. 11 people had been in that room from the start, and each person's acknowledgement carried institutional weight because this was the same social field where my credibility had been eroded publicly. No one supported keeping the warning. No one defended the 2 out of 5 once the chronology was laid out. The correction was entered before we adjourned. Priya submitted the amendment in HRIS while we watched. Owen verified the new revision line appeared. My record changed in real time in front of everyone who had watched me absorb months of dismissal. Dana tried one last move, saying intent had been developmental and process imperfections should not overshadow leadership judgment. Maya answered with a sentence I will remember for a long time. She said, process integrity is leadership judgment in a regulated environment, and retroactive discipline insertion is incompatible with people management responsibility. That language named the methodology exactly, and naming mattered. Without naming, misconduct stays fuzzy and repeatable. With naming, witnesses understand what they saw and what is no longer acceptable. Dana went quiet after that, and for once silence worked against her instead of against me. My merit impact was addressed next because compensation was tied to rating band in our framework. Priya confirmed that restoring 4 out of 5 restored eligibility for the 4% increase, effective with the same cycle timing that would have applied absent the disputed rating. She also confirmed my profile would be returned to the May promotion slate review list. Mia added that candidacy would be evaluated on documented performance history and current role needs, not on the now voided warning narrative. Those 2 confirmations fixed practical damage, salary trajectory, and advancement access, not just language in a file. When the meeting ended, people stood slowly like they were unsure what expression fit the moment. A few offered polite nods that felt like retrospective courage. Luis said quietly that he was sorry he had not spoken sooner. I told him he spoke when it counted. Priya stayed behind to confirm next procedural steps, corrected review release, documentation of dispute outcome, and notation that the original warning entry was void under policy non-compliance. Owen packed his laptop and hesitated at the door. He asked whether I had a minute once the room cleared. I said yes. He told me he had seen patterns like this before and had stayed quiet too often, because compliance staff are measured on neutrality and punished for visibility. He said this time the chronology was too clear to let procedural caution become complicity. Hearing that did not erase the weeks of uncertainty, but it resolved a different thread I had carried alone, whether anyone else had seen what was happening while it was happening. He had seen it. He had chosen a moment where evidence could not be dismissed. We exchanged numbers afterward, and, in a way that surprised me, started checking in as colleagues outside crisis contexts. By May 2026, Dana was reassigned pending investigation into people management conduct. The reassignment removed direct reports from her line immediately. Within weeks, she exited management track altogether. HR did not share every detail, and I did not chase gossip. I cared about outcomes that were visible and durable. Her authority over performance documentation was gone. The review corrections stood, my compensation was corrected. My promotion candidacy remained active. In the weeks that followed, the tone in team forums changed in small, measurable ways. Fewer weaponized comments about communication style, more requests for source verification when definitions changed, more caution around discipline language in public meetings. People sometimes ask what I felt at the exact moment the rating changed on screen. Relief was part of it, anger too, and a kind of tiredness that settled in after sustained vigilance. The deeper feeling was recognition without theatre. I did not need to declare my competence because the room had already watched the record prove what my silence had been protecting. I had been calm through humiliation, and that calm had been misread as weakness until evidence gave it context. Once context arrived, the same behaviour looked like discipline, which is what it had been all along. I thought a lot about the younger analysts who watched this unfold. In prestige systems, people learn what power can get away with by observing unresolved harm. They also learn what standards mean when standards are enforced in public. The correction had to happen in front of witnesses, because the harm had been performed in front of witnesses. Private apologies would have protected the architecture that made this possible. Public amendment changed that architecture, at least in our corner of it, by showing that policy language can become action when chronology is testable and people with access decide to tell the truth. My own role after the dispute changed in practical ways first. Mia asked me to co-lead a documentation integrity workstream, which included review template controls and manager training refresh on discipline protocols. Priya invited me to provide analyst-side input on acknowledgement workflows, where confusion between coaching and warning categories had created avoidable risk. I accepted both requests because reform from outside complaint channels rarely sticks, unless people who absorb the failure help redesign the process. This was the first time I'd been invited into policy repair immediately after a conflict, and it felt like the institution had decided to learn instead of just contain. Luis kept his head down for a while after calibration, which I understood. Being conflict avoidant had protected him until it cost him sleep, and changing that pattern in a hierarchy is not quick. He sent me a written follow-up saying he wanted to be better about documenting what he saw in real time, not only when asked. I told him that intention matters less than habit, and habit starts with one action at a time. He started keeping meeting notes with explicit speaker attribution for high-stakes discussions. I saw him do it. Small corrections in witness behaviour are how cultures shift slowly and stay shifted. My promotion outcome came later in the May cycle. Reopening candidacy did not guarantee selection, and I did not want symbolic restitution. I wanted evaluation on the same standard applied to everyone else in that slate. Mia confirmed my file had been reviewed with the corrected record and historical performance context intact. I remained on track, which was the phrase she used, and she paired it with specific development expectations for the next level so there would be no ambiguity about what came next. Clarity felt better than ceremony. Clarity is what I had been asking for since the first missing invite in March. The hardest part to explain to people outside this kind of system is why I stayed so quiet while it was happening. Silence can look like surrender from a distance. In my case, it was sequencing. If I had tried to win through real-time confrontation, Dana could have recast everything as interpersonal conflict between manager and direct report. By holding to short, precise responses and moving quickly through formal channels, I made the dispute about verifiable process defects. That shift created space for Priya to apply policy, for Owen to produce metadata, for Luis to give a witness statement, and for Mia to act without political fog. I still remember one particular morning in late March when Dana excluded me from another leadership huddle, and I sat at my desk staring at a blank email draft, deciding whether to ask why. The obstacle at that moment was uncertainty about what action would preserve my leverage. If I challenged exclusion directly, she could deny intent and isolate me further. I chose a different move. I sent a neutral request for decisions and rationale related to measure definition changes from that huddle. Her thin, summary response omitted rationale again. That omission became evidence of pattern, and pattern later supported my claim that process access had been manipulated. Another crucial decision happened on April 9th when I filed within the 10-business-day window. The obstacle was fear that filing would intensify retaliation before any facts were reviewed. Delay would have closed the only formal path to correction. Filing on day one resolved that hesitation and triggered mandatory HR review timelines, which forced the case into documented channels where Dana could not control every interaction. Procedure gets dismissed as bureaucracy until you need it to hold a line against someone with positional power. In this case, policy deadlines gave me structure when everything else felt unstable. When Priya confirmed on April 14th that an entry existed, the obstacle shifted again. Presence of a warning entry could have ended the dispute if nobody looked deeper. I asked for metadata immediately because existence alone did not answer chronology. That request made Timeline testable, and testability moved us toward a result grounded in system behavior, not personalities. I had learned that lesson years earlier in data work. Never accept a record at face value when the question is sequence. Who created it, when, and in what order relative to related events usually tells you where the truth starts. During the worst week, people advised me to let it go in ways that sounded compassionate and functioned as pressure. Their logic was pragmatic: keep your head down, avoid escalation, wait for a transfer opportunity. I understood that instinct. I also understood the trade-off. If I accepted a fabricated warning in my file, every future disagreement could be reframed through that false precedent, and my credibility would be pre-damaged before I spoke. Disputing the review carried risk. Not disputing it guaranteed long-term damage. Once that became clear, the path stopped feeling optional. The public nature of the final correction mattered to my internal wound more than I expected. I had spent years being told, implicitly and explicitly, that my value appeared only when cleanup was needed, never when authority was being assigned. In that calibration room, authority came from the same source I had trusted all along: documented reality. I did not leave triumphant. I left settled. People who had watched me be diminished had watched the record reverse under scrutiny, and I did not have to perform anger or victory to make that land. I only had to remain coherent when coherence was expensive. Owen and I met for coffee a week later, mostly to decompress and partly to compare notes on how organizations handle inconvenient evidence. He said he had expected informal backlash for speaking so clearly in calibration. Some of that arrived. He got curt messages about staying in his lane. He documented those too. I told him visibility can feel like punishment right after you break a pattern, and he laughed for the first time since the meeting. That conversation became the start of a professional trust that outlived the dispute, which is not something I predicted when his name first appeared on Priya's email thread. Priya's role deserves precision because people often flatten HR into a single stereotype. She was procedural and evidence-driven from start to finish, and that mattered because procedural rigor can protect either power or fairness depending on who applies it. She could have treated my concern as interpersonal conflict and closed it with generic coaching guidance. She did not. She verified policy requirements, acknowledged discrepancies, escalated to compliance, and stayed in the room until amendment was entered. She also documented the correction language clearly enough that no one could quietly reinsert the same narrative later under softer wording. Mia's role was different. Directors in these moments manage trade-offs between fairness and organizational self-protection. The easy path is to smooth conflict privately and avoid naming specific misconduct. Mia chose public clarity inside the formal forum, which constrained future revisionism. Once she said retroactive discipline insertion in front of that group, people understood exactly what had happened and exactly why the decision was being reversed. Institutions do not change because one person wins a dispute. They change when leaders define unacceptable behavior in language that others must carry forward. There was one detail I kept returning to in the weeks after. Dinah had assumed I would challenge her emotionally in public meetings, and she had prepared for that version of me. She had no plan for a quiet dispute built on timestamps, policy windows, and witness statements. Her confidence relied on a common dynamic that people who are publicly minimized either explode or withdraw. I did neither. I filed, requested logs, and waited for the room where chronology would matter more than rank. Calm did not remove pain. Calm made strategy possible while pain was still present. By the end of May 2026, my corrected review sat in HRIS, with the warning voided, rating restored to 4 out of 5, merit at 4%, and promotion candidacy reopened in the active cycle. Dana was off the management track. Louise had a witness habit he did not have before. Owen had crossed from quiet ally to trusted colleague. Priya had reinforced a process that worked when tested. Mia had shown the room how accountability sounds when spoken plainly. The same people who watched the humiliation watched the correction. And that symmetry is the only reason the ending felt complete. I carried one last lesson out of that room. Recognition I had chased in earlier years always felt fragile because it depended on someone's mood or favor. Recognition grounded in evidence survives personalities. I did not need Dana to agree with me, and I did not need witnesses to like me. I needed the record to hold under scrutiny in front of people with authority to act on it. Once that happened, I could return to work without narrating my own worth every week. Quiet authority feels like that. Less performance, more alignment between what is true and what is finally written down.